From food and gas to healthcare and housing, everything seems more expensive these days, with little relief in sight. Today's guest, noted economist, forecaster, and finance commentator Joe Lavorgna, has spent a lifetime looking into some of the major reasons: monetary policy by the Fed, record spending by the government, unpredictable pressures from abroad, and now one big X factor: the 2024 presidential campaign, an election that impacts the bottom line. From Ballard Studios in Washington, D.C., it's 13th and Park.
We give you information, not a panic attack.
I mean, look what's going on. I mean, my God.
This was it. My kids were gonna die.
That time is gone forever.
This is the biggest story in America.
We weren't prepared for this.
Don't you want to speak truth to power?
Toughest thing I ever had to do.
Well, Joe, welcome to the show. The words that keep coming at us are the words, the Fed. Are they doing a good job? Are they missing anything that perhaps that they need to address that gives all of us a little more comfort going to sleep at night?
There's a little bit of the, beauty lies in the art of the beholder. So many will argue the Fed's done a good job because inflation was at 9%. It's down roughly to 3-something, depending on which series you're looking at. The Fed has raised rates, but they haven't let their balance sheet shrink. They've actually created bank reserves. So while the Fed is fighting all this expansionary and unnecessary fiscal stimulus, the Fed also is fighting its own policy where it's letting its balance sheet expand at the same time it's trying to raise rates. So there's a lot of inconsistencies. I guess I would give the Fed probably a C plus B minus. They haven't done a terrible job, but the way I see things is they could do a much better job. And I think part of the problem is that it's a little bit institutional in the sense that I wish there was more disagreement among policymakers. There's all this transparency, but there seems to be too much emphasis and desire institutionally to have a consensus. And this has been developing over the decades. We need a more vibrant, I think, discussion and debate. Economists are known not to agree on things. And here we are, the 19 people go to these FOMC meetings and they're almost all unanimous in these votes.
So I think people would call that groupthink, right? They're guilty of that, when what we really need maybe is independent thought to try to figure out something, Joe, obviously that's very, very complex.
Greenspan, I thought, was masterful in kind of the doublespeak and not being, transparent. And he said, if you think you understood what I said, then you're mistaken. The brilliance in that was that the markets tend to sometimes move to one side, and leverage and capital goes in that direction. And what you really want is two-way risk in markets. And one of the things I think the Fed did incorrectly and did wrong was this thing called forward guidance, where they would say, look, we're not going to raise rates for X amount of time. We're going to keep rates low. And what that does is it causes massive capital misallocation. And that's one of the reasons we had this banking crisis, this regional banking crisis, which still is afflicting the economy. It hasn't led to a recession yet, but it certainly hurt pockets of the economy and lending in certain borrowers. And that's in part because the Fed said it was when it raised rates, it was going to do so slowly. And this is in March of 22. Right. And then, of course, raised rates within 9 months, more than double what they had said at that March meeting. And of course, the banks were underwater. And you could blame the banks and bad risk management, which I understand. But at the same time, they're also following the Fed's lead.
It's kind of a sticky wicket, right? Because right now, the big expectation, and of course, the conversation too, for the last, what has it been, Joe, half a year, has been, when are they going to cut the rates? When, right? And it seems like every meeting, we're waiting for the white smoke to emanate from the chimney, from the Vatican, and we're going to see some miracle happen, some breakthrough happen. It hasn't happened yet. Is that something we, as the American people, are putting pressure on the Fed, or is it in reverse? The Fed should be a little bit more descriptive, perhaps at times, in where they want to go.
So the question is, why did Chair Powell pivot last December? My guess is that there were concerns about the banking system because real interest rates, which are interest rates adjusted for inflation, were rising rapidly. However, with the effect of that verbal pivot, those verbal comments that our next move will be cuts and possibly multiple cuts, caused markets to ease financial conditions, meaning equities rallied massively. The dollar softened. Credit spreads, meaning the rates that corporate borrowers pay relative to treasuries, those collapsed. Basically, it was like an easing of monetary policy. Right. The problem is that offsets what the Fed's trying to do and slow the economy to bring inflation down. We started this year with about 7 interest rate cuts, 150 basis points of easing, because the market responded to Powell's comments. They were doing what was the logical, reasonable thing. Under a Greenspanian approach, the Fed would not have said that. It would have let the data dictate how they unfold. and the market wouldn't have been where it is. Equity market wouldn't be probably anywhere near as high as it is now, but then they wouldn't add the stimulus to complicate the Fed's job. So in some ways, again, they kind of created a problem of their own making. And this is the issue, because when the Fed says something, the markets front run what they're going to do. So we priced all these, and the Fed hadn't even moved. And the only way you get around it would be kind of put the, Pandora's box, put everything back in the box and not be as transparent. But politically at this point, that's very, very difficult to do.
Well, a lot of people have been following your career in Deutsche Bank to where you are today, a career that included a little time in the White House during a very, very difficult period of time for the country, COVID-19, a lot of questions about how to open the economy, how quickly to open the economy. How much of a challenge was that as a key economic advisor during that period to former President Trump? How different was that for you in confronting something that very few people had ever had to face?
One of the first days I was there, the S&P, I think, dropped something like 13% on the day, 13%.
Welcome to your new job, right?
Yeah. The market's worried about the human toll and what the economy would happen globally and all these other factors. And, we're very conscious of the health effects, but also the fact that, if the economy wasn't going to reopen at some point, there wouldn't be an economy to go back to. So it certainly was a very difficult time. We talked, myself and Larry Kudlow, who was my boss, we talked about V-shaped recovery. And of course, President Trump called it an I-shaped recovery. And to the president's credit, when the economy reopened, things rebounded very dramatically. We had roughly a 30% drop in GDP in the second quarter when the economy was effectively shut for 6 weeks, and then a roughly 30% bounce in the third quarter. I think a lot of that reopening continued well into 2021, and we got, maybe it was an I-shaped recovery. Things were pretty robust, but it was a difficult time. The Fed at that point, I might add, did a very good job of providing liquidity to the markets, and the Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, worked very well together. The CARES Act was unanimous, and then when they made some mild changes in June, it was a re-upping of some policies. I think there was one dissent in the Congress. So believe it or not, this is divisive of the world we're in. For a period of time anyway, we came together. So it was a very challenging time, but thankfully we came out of it, I think, as best we could have, given the fact there was no roadmap for what everybody lived through.
But one thing, of course, that happened from that period, and it was accelerated, was government spending.
Yeah.
When you say to record levels, it's almost to unbelievable levels. How much is that impacting what's going on right now, Joe, in terms of families across America seeing nothing but rising prices on everything that they depend on for life?
So the CBO today, right before we started the show, is forecasting now a 6.7% budget deficit this year, this fiscal year. And unemployment almost certainly is going to average under 4%. We have never had anything approaching 7% deficit to GDP with unemployment low. I mean, we've had big deficits. We had a big deficit, obviously, during the pandemic because the economy was forced to close. But then, of course, things accelerated, the finance and everything improved dramatically. So we're generating these massive deficits. It's at effectively full employment. We've never done that before. And the problem, of course, is that government spending is creating artificial demand, and artificial demand is keeping those goods and service prices higher than they otherwise would be. And unfortunately, we're at this point in time where we can't seem to dial back on that spending. And when we have a recession, as we inevitably will, and by the way, the CBO forecasts, they're nonpartisan, highly respected group. They do a good job. They do the best job anybody, I think, in that role can do. They're not even forecasting a recession. So you can imagine what happens if there is a recession. You'll go from 6-7% deficits to 10 or 11%. And at some point, one would worry that the ability to finance that debt will come into question. Certainly keep interest rates high. It's making households pay more for interest-sensitive items, which is why we're starting to see weakness in consumer goods spending, while we're seeing weakness in retail sales. The cost of big-ticket items to finance is much higher today than it was 3 or 4 years ago. And banks, because the yield curve's inverted and the Fed's got to keep rates high because they're fighting inflation, bank lending and credit creation isn't as high. So not only is it expensive to borrow, it's also hard oftentimes to get credit on good terms.
What's really interesting is inflation's picked back up in the last 4 months. So the people who believed inflation would fall, as I did, were right for a very long period of time. The people worried about inflation were wrong, but I don't think a lot of people caught the last 4 months. It shows you how difficult and complex the economy is right now. You're basically on an unsustainable debt trajectory. Right. Debt to GDP rising 160, 170%. And it's in large part because of the aging of the population, demographics, et cetera. So there is a problem on the spending side, and I'm not sure how to address it.
We are into an unsustainable debt trajectory. Talk about that.
So if you look at the CBO's numbers, we're going to approach 160, 170% debt to GDP over the next 20, 25 years. And the biggest driver, or one of the biggest drivers of that, is Medicare, Medicaid spending because the population is getting older. That's going to be hard to change, right? We know what those numbers are based on demographics. It's one of the few things that people could forecast with some degree of certainty. Population is not getting any younger. So we need to do something, obviously, to get us on a more sustainable trajectory. The best way, of course, would be faster economic growth that generates more revenues. The issue really is on the spending side. We're running unsustainable federal spending as a share of GDP at the moment, and CBO is projecting that going forward. And that's the real problem that we have in these longer term projections. The question is, what causes us to deal with the problem? My concern and fear is that the markets ultimately will force a solution, that it won't be political, that basically our inability to borrow, with rates perhaps going significantly higher, a Liz Truss UK moment, so to speak, in a much bigger fashion, might be the catalyst maybe to get us to deal with the spending side. But, right now it doesn't look optimistic, and I'm an optimist, generally speaking.
Well, you mentioned Liz Truss. Let's go international for a second. How much are you concerned about the impact of geopolitical events? We're talking about the war in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza. How much is that impacting all of this in terms of our own situation here at home?
These geopolitical events are very important, obviously, but they've not had a huge effect yet on the U.S. economy. And I don't know if they will. Typically, when you have geopolitical events, the most important commodity for production is oil. And if oil supplies are meaningfully cut, like we saw back in OPEC in the 70s, prices surge, and that could cause a inflationary recession. Historically, in the past, when we've had different events, you go back to the wars in Iraq, markets get nervous and they adjust relatively quickly. So we're following the geopolitics, but they matter most in terms of an economy when they stop the flow of business. So, for example, if there's anything to stop the flow of semiconductor production, things of that sort, you would worry about the impact in the U.S. But like these events, while troublesome and worrisome, markets generally are able to deal with that type of uncertainty. It's only when the things we need, the product we need, we can't get, that the geopolitics then has a real meaningful economic impact where you could have a downturn.
So, Joe, how did you become an economist? Why did you become an economist? Who were your biggest influences? John Maynard Keynes, Alan Greenspan? I mean, who are we looking at?
My dad is a teacher, and he told me that any good professor will make any class interesting. And I always had interest in economics. I like political science and politics, and I thought if I could argue the economics, I'd be better at the politics. And I had a really good teacher who taught a money and banking class that got me really interested in the Federal Reserve. So I wrote my honors thesis, undergrad, and then wound up getting a job effectively at the open market desk, doing all the work that my undergraduate degree had given me to get that job. And then I just sort of fell in love with the discipline. It's a little bit for me like sports radio. You like talking markets and interest rates and the economy and all these big picture things. I think it's fun. And I'm a bit quirky, and I kind of just got lucky and fell into my lap. So that's the short end of it.
I'm now going to refer to this as the sport of economics. I love that.
The sport of economics. Yeah, because people always, you go at a party, I say, what's the economy going to do? Where interest rates, we think it's stock market. And my standard response is, look, I don't work on the weekends because, but that's why I say sports radio. It's one of those things people love to talk about. It doesn't really matter what your politics are, whether you're liberal or conservative, Democrat, Republican, Independent. People want to know where rates are going or what your opinion is on things. And whether you're right or wrong, people like the story, the narrative, the way you think. And it's always fun. It never gets old. And obviously, these markets are very challenging, very interesting. So there's always plenty to talk about.
So, Joe, final question for everyone out there who is nervous about making ends meet. Are you still bullish for them and bullish for this country and to be able to work through these many challenges you've been talking about?
I am an optimist. My old boss, Larry Kudlow, is a diehard optimist. He made me an optimist. He's certainly somebody that was sort of my college hero. He's a long backstory, which I won't go into now, but Larry's somebody I deeply admire and respect. And I think you have to be optimistic. Maybe you could be a little cynical on sometimes how the world works, but try to find the optimism. We're incredibly innovative and incredibly dynamic, incredibly entrepreneurial. That doesn't change overnight. And I'm hopeful eventually the political situation will calm down a bit and people go back to their lives. But yes, I'm long-term very optimistic on the U.S.
I was going to ask you for a stock tip, but given you don't give those out even on weekends, we won't go there. I want to thank you for being a part of the show. Larry Kudlow would be very proud of you and where your career has gone, as you have been of him. America really needs to understand the things that impact day-to-day living and day-to-day cost. And I think what you're doing and what you're trying to do and have done, important things, not just for the country, but to all the kids and grandkids to come who are going to inherit this future that we've created. Good luck to you, and thanks again for joining us on 13th and Park.
I appreciate your kind words. Thank you so much.